How we doing?
I'm good. I'm good. There we are. How you doing? You hear me okay?
I got you. We got good sound.
Good deal. Ooh, you've been busy.
Yeah? What's been going on?
No, you've been busy, man.
Oh, yeah.
Doing your show and stuff, man.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Not me, man. I'm in retirement mode. We're trying to get there.
That's what I was going to ask you. I know stuff like, my question to have you come on and speak and more stuff coming at you. What does retirement actually mean for you?
So it began with, I was the executive director for LEAP for 10 years, 10 and a half years. And it was 5.5 years longer than what I'd planned. So it began with that in December. I turned the reins over to Diane Goldstein. She's out west, former law enforcement from California. Okay. And I'm still on the board, but as the treasurer. Okay. But I've been trying to kick more of this work into the hands. I mean, there's so many great current and retired police officers out there that really want to change the system. They want to look. They want to defund the police. They want to give a lot of stuff away and get to the place of where they're just dealing with violent crime, man. They want to give up this minor traffic enforcement stuff. So basically, there are a lot of good cops out there that want to do some good stuff. So I'm just trying to kick it to them, working with some folks on community responder type work. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's okay. Yeah. So it's looking at all these 911 calls, all these calls that come into the centers, and just saying who can handle this stuff better than the cops can. And it's, for the most part, it's just about anybody, really. But so retirement for me is just trying to hand the torch over to some of these younger folks, to keep the ball rolling, to deal with all the work that needs to be done. And I actually moved out of Baltimore. My wife and I moved in December from Baltimore down to Florida. As a matter of fact, a lot of my buddies, my best friend actually moved to Orlando, and now we're talking about, maybe we can flip the state next time around.
Oh yeah, that's happened. Texas is, the conversation about it turning blue, but no matter what, going away from hardcore Republicanism it used to be before, that's happened.
Yeah.
So, a lot of.
So anyway, got this stuff growing, like you, but mine's a little. Mine's a little worse. Mine's a little gray, a lot gray.
Hey, I want to get there one day.
Yeah. So anyway,
you were talking about, the unnecessary calls. Basically, we got to a place where we can call them those, right? And just driving around, with my show and what I do for work, DoorDash, I use this music service called Live Mixtapes. Okay. And what's interesting about Live Mixtapes is it looks at where you are and gives you basically commercials about your local area, right?
Nice.
So mine is sounds different than most people's because you'll get Metro Nashville service because I drive all over Tennessee, New Jersey, all over the East Coast. You'll get Pennsylvania drug treatment facility things, right? Which is what I'm hearing as I'm up here. Like every commercial is the Pennsylvania drug treatment facility thing. Okay. But one of the main ones that comes from Nashville is them saying, please stop sending emergency calls to 311, right? Every year, Metro Nashville gets XYZ amount of calls that after everything's dealt with, it turns out this should have been 311, this should not have been 911. And they have a commercial just to tell people for these things, don't call 911, right? Right. And the crux of what we're basically talking about is paring that down even more, where everybody is having an armed person come respond to situation X. It's a homeless person with a mental health issue. That does not make sense, right?
That's what we're talking about, yeah.
Versus this kind of, I've seen one of your appearances you were on with Don Lemon, and it became this semantic thing where we're more or less, they agree with everything you were saying, but the phrase defund the police scares me is more or less what they continue to say to you. Right. So part of this is on one hand, repackaging something, because the people who are really committed understand what that really means and what we really want to see from that.
Mm-hmm.
But then also those people who, there's two camps. You got people operating in good faith who really are seeking to understand and don't understand, right? And then you got people who are playing semantic games with you. They simply don't want to see it happen. And you understand that's what this conversation is.
Yeah. And all these folks you hear, you know, condemning the defund the police, they know what the hell we're talking about.
Right.
We're talking about reinventing the police. We're talking about changing the policing paradigm. We're talking about creating a policing model that works for everybody. All right. Because the current one was never designed for everybody. And we, you know, I mean, if you know anything about history and policing, it wasn't designed for us. It wasn't designed for Black folks. It wasn't designed for Mexicans. It really wasn't even designed for poor folks.
Right.
Even though a large swath, if not most of your cops come from poor families.
Same with the military.
Yep. So it's about that. That's what it's really about. You know, maybe one day, 150 years from now, we can truly abolish the police, but we have a lot of work to do socially before we can ever get there, racially before we can ever get there. So many other things we need to deal with within families and communities and neighborhoods. I think we're closer to abolishing prisons than police yet, because unfortunately, we are going to need a system, a process, some people to deal with the crazies out there that continue to prey on folk, man. And they're out there, you know, and whatever that looks like in the future, you know. But this minor crap that we're sending the police on, you know, like you said earlier, why are we sending an armed person to these mental health issues? Why are we sending, you know, why do we have armed people stopping cars because there's a tag light out or something or cracked windshield? Why don't we get your car inspected every year? Have that a requirement, right? The police don't have to stop you for equipment anymore. You know, why are we stopping people who aren't a danger to anyone?
And
we know what that's about, because the police have lobbied politicians over the years to give them tools so that they can just stop people and then look for other things.
Find a reason later.
Absolutely. Pretextual stops tied to other things. The war on drugs has a big role in this. Well, you know, if we can stop enough cars, we're going to find the drugs that are coming into our neighborhoods and communities. You know, these bad drug kingpins and these violent dog whistle Black folks out there selling drugs to our kids. You know, all of that stuff.
And that's one of the things we want to get into. Hey, let's jump right in. So welcome everybody.
All right.
Facebook, Patreon, YouTube, all over social media. I'm here with retired Major Neil Franklin, here talking about, man, the issues of our day. I wish I could say they're just the issues of our day, but just in doing the research for our interview, I looked back at a couple of articles. There was one in Harper's Magazine, right? Guy named Dan Baum. This is back in, I believe, the 80s. Okay. Interviewed a guy named, what was it? Eichelman. I think it's Erickman. But he was a guy who was an advisor to Richard Nixon when they were first getting.
John Ehrlichman.
Ehrlichman, there you go.
Yeah.
And he was kind of admitting this had nothing to do with stopping drugs. That was never their focus. That was never their primary concern. This was a political strategy to repress the left and repress, you know, Black people in large, but minorities across the country, primarily us, right? And he just kind of candidly admitted that. This is 10 years after they kind of started the whole expedition. But talk about that. What does that do to all these years of literal war in the United States? All these people incarcerated, killed, overdoses that we just let happen because we weren't dealing with it. And at the end of the day, it was this guy's just political project.
Man, there's just so much to talk about regarding what you just raised. There was a show on CNN last night about race. And in the evening, and it was talking about the Republican Party, and it was talking about it gave the history of the Republican Party and where it was back during the days of Jackie Robinson, and who was a Republican, and how he came away from the Republican Party. It talked about Barry Goldwater, you know, and his mission back then to use these fear tactics and the fear mongering and all that stuff. And it brought us through time, you know, up to where you're talking about with Richard Nixon, you know, and the war on drugs and the Southern strategy, right? Bringing all of these Southern states online into the Republican Party from a place of, I can say it, not just fear mongering, but, you know, law and order, and from a place of extremism. And they actually talked about that, the extremism, and that's what we saw back on January 6th, right, at the Capitol.
It finally spilled over after a while.
Yeah, so you're talking about John Ehrlichman, one of Richard Nixon's advisors, and the Southern strategy, where, you know, not word for word, but basically it says that, you know, basically what he was saying is that the Vietnam War protesters and Black folk are problems for them right now politically. And they can use the war on drugs to go after their organizations, to go after powerful individuals who are speaking about civil rights and trying to do things in the civil rights era, you know, who are talking about the Vietnam War. We can raid their homes, we can raid their offices, we can lock them up and literally wreak havoc. That's basically what he was saying, what the plan was that Richard Nixon had put forth with the war on drugs. And here we are today, you know, 50 something years later, you know, dealing with what we are now. And finally, folks were saying, oh my, drug use is a health issue, really? Right. You're just realizing that, huh? After the millions, literally millions of folks, Black folks that had been arrested over the decades and jailed for using drugs. You know, but basically, and of course, that's been my, you know, it's been my position for a very long time. It hasn't always been that way, because I was also, you know, walking around my eyes shut, that the war on drugs has always been bogus. And it really goes back to 100 years ago, or, you know, just in the early part of the 20th century, to a guy by the name of Harry Anslinger, who after alcohol prohibition started his war on drugs, which was a racially, socially motivated war on drugs back then.
Reefer Madness.
Reefer Madness, going after jazz singers and musicians. A lot of people don't know that Billie Holiday, now Anslinger was who we considered this country's really first drug czar. You know, he was the one who really started this effort of going after Black folks and Mexicans in the southwest part of the country for marijuana, cannabis. But one of his first main targets was Billie Holiday. Because if you ever listen to her music, her like the music of Black folks, a lot of Black folks back then, you're talking about what's happening, you know, what has happened, what is happening, and how wrong it is, and how things need to change. And so she was a thorn in his side, and plus she was a heroin user. So a very popular Black woman jazz singer made a very excellent target for somebody like Harry Anslinger. And there are many who believe, like me, from the research that I've done, that he and his henchmen are responsible for her death. But there's so much more to that history, and you know, I'll just give a quick book for people to read so that they can learn the history, you know, what we're talking about here. And that is a book called Chasing the Scream, you know, like Scream. Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari. Excellent book.
Gotcha. I gotta check it out. And you know, when I was looking at that quote from you know, in Dan Bowden's book in Harper Magazine, I was kind of asking myself, So, okay, that's how this version of it got started, this more modern drug war, right?
Right.
But
Right.
how did we start this practice just in general? And they talked about it. The nation's very first drug laws in the United States was back in
Right.
1875 in San Francisco, and it was
Yeah, I know where you're going.
anti-opium, right?
Absolutely.
So just seeing how they're able to repackage it, opium at one point, right? That's the danger. The Chinese are going to come and destroy your culture, and so on. Just a little while longer, alcohol, right?
But let's stick a pin in that for a second.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about the opium and the Chinese, right? Because that law really only affected the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't so much about the culture. What the real target, as we come through time over and over and over again, is protecting white women. But anyway, go ahead.
But see, there's a through line, exactly what you pointed to. It's always been some way of repackaging racial resentment, right? Anxiety about these people coming in and somehow taking something away from you. And the low-hanging fruit is, of course, your women. You know, how problematic that is in another sense for women is another discussion. Just
yeah, but you're right. The alcohol prohibition after that coming forward, which only lasted 13 years, right? Because it was so problematic, because the violence that came from it, you know, in Chicago, with folks like Bugsy Siegel and Al Capone, and you know, those henchmen, the corruption with cops and judges and prosecutors, you know, the cost, tax dollars in and of itself. But they ended up really with more underground speakeasies, right? Underground clubs than they had above ground pubs before alcohol prohibition. So, and what a lot of people don't realize is that it wasn't illegal to drink booze during those 13 years. It was illegal to manufacture it, to transport it, and to sell it. So basically what we're talking about is the decriminalization, to decriminalize alcohol use is what it was. So when people talk about, well, can't we just decriminalize drugs like marijuana and cocaine or heroin? Can't we just decriminalize those or decriminalize the use of those? No, you're just talking alcohol prohibition. And we're still going to have all the nonsense to come, you know, like we did with alcohol prohibition. You've got to regulate it and control it. You got to put it in a legalized, regulated market for grown folk, for adults. It's just that simple. And plus, you'll have much safer products out there than the current model.
Because otherwise, you leave all the money on the table and all of the motivation to commit crimes and go get that money, of course, is still it, right?
Oh, I'm going to throw something else at you here. Look, here we are talking about the horrors of alcohol prohibition. We know we're living the horrors of drug prohibition right now, you know, with the ones I just mentioned earlier. But now, you know, they're moving in a direction of tobacco prohibition. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't smoke. I don't want anyone to smoke. I don't want kids to start smoking, do everything I can to prevent that from happening. But prohibiting the sale, the manufacturing and the sale of tobacco products, do you understand that will be just as big as the current mess that we're in now with the war on drugs and alcohol prohibition, which we already dealt with? I mean, we've made tremendous progress in educating people and with smoking cessation programs to get people to quit. And the one product that they're beginning this effort with is menthol cigarettes.
Right.
Now, most of the Black folks that I know who smoke menthol cigarettes, Newport, cool. You know, those types of cigarettes. So if we prohibit the sale of menthol cigarettes, do you really think that folks in my neighborhood and your neighborhood are going to stop smoking menthol cigarettes? Hell no. We're going to find a way to get them, and we're going to sell them, and we're going to be selling them on street corners like we do Lucy's. Eric Gardner, right? Was on a street corner selling some cigarettes. What happened to him? Here come the police enforcing that law, right? And we have a deceased Eric Gardner at the hands of the police. And so
it comes back to that through line you were just talking about, because opium, the Chinese, right? They had a big part of prohibition with alcohol, right? The Catholics, the Irish, the Italians were coming here taking something away from you, right?
That's right.
The drug war, us. Going back to it, still us with tobacco, because again, it's targeted to who? Right? It's not everybody's cigarettes. It's those specific ones of those dangerous people, right?
Right.
So with that as a part of it, right? How do we get back to it? Going back to that original problem, which is really just trying to find a way to knock down each other's communities. How do we attack that? Because it seems like a lot of these laws, a lot of these police agencies and so on that go about enforcing these laws, the main goal is to go at that specific community. Because again, there's lots of, affluent people who smoke cigarettes, and we don't see them being pulled out of any cars for their weed, their cocaine. We go back to the 80s. Remember, crack cocaine treated one way. Let's say somebody like Hunter Biden's soft cocaine, not treated the same way.
Hey, remember Studio 54 up in New York, man? I've never been there, but I know the history of it and so on. And cocaine was flowing through that place like crazy. Like, well, your socialites, your Hollywood, the wealthy, no problem at all with their cocaine. But when you change the form of it from powder to rock to crack, now it's a whole different story, right? It's so, George, none of this is ever about the substance,
right?
It's never about the alcohol. It's not about the drugs. It's not about the tobacco. It's all about people. And I think you mentioned that. It's all about, how do I attack a particular culture? And I blame our elected officials for most, if not all of this. It's because they're in many cases, they are playing to and even establishing the fears into the minds of the populace, of their constituents, right? So they can get their votes. If I can put fear into their minds and then sell them a bill of goods saying that I'm the one who can free you of this or make this better, all you have to do is give me your vote. And I was getting ready, I got to watch my words sometimes. But the person who just left the White House, right, who was kicked out of the White House, is one of those people. He's very good at it. But so our politicians, when we talk about, and you asked the question, how do we deal with this? How do we improve this? How do we make it better? And one of the things that we must, it's a mixed bag of things, but one of the things that we must do is we must go after the ballot boxes. So all this work and effort that's now happening to prevent these laws from coming into place, restricting and in some cases prohibiting our voting power, those need to be stamped out. And, so we have to continue to pound the ballot box, even if some of these laws, like in Georgia, go through. You know what? Unfortunately, we have to work around them. And we've got to encourage and get and motivate people to get to the ballot box so that then we can change those laws. We need voter referendums. And, that process of voter referendum, we need that in just about every state across this country. And we have to force our elected officials to change that policy. There are a number of states where you see most of the progress. It's in states that have voter referendum, where I can go get enough signatures, have a particular piece of law, policy put onto the ballot for the people to vote on, right? But in my home state of Maryland, that's not the process. It's the elected officials, it's our delegates and our senators who craft the laws, who have to get them passed. And even if they want to allow the voters to vote on something, they're the ones that have to say, okay, we'll put this on the next ballot for the voters to decide. We're not going to do it. We'll let the voters decide. So we have very few opportunities for the voters to decide on a piece of policy in the state of Maryland, and many states are like that.
And there in Maryland, I'm seeing progress. You know, we're talking about police reform. There's a guy named Will Jawando. He's on the city council. I can't remember the city in Maryland. You know, I want to get it right. But one of the things they're dealing with now is removing the school resource officers, right? Along the same line we've been talking about, you know, having somebody there to respond to a student with an emotional health or mental health issue, a student experiencing homelessness. That's one thing. But having an armed guard who, you know, I lived in Knoxville, Tennessee until just recently. They at a school called Austinites. I don't know if you saw national news, but they just recently came into the school to deal with a student who did have a gun. He had a gun, but the net result was his death. Right. Versus just from living in East Tennessee, many times where I've seen in other schools, mostly white schools, a student will have a gun. They'll call the parent to the school. A counselor will speak to the student. They will give them the gun. The student leaves alive. Right. So the lack of the understanding that that's the appropriate response in so many of these scenarios has led to that eventuality where they're literally removing the school resource officers. You know, hopefully it doesn't take them coming and killing your son or daughter for that to happen in your state, right?
Right.
What are the things that tend to get people to understand this isn't like the idea of defund the police and take something away.
Right.
This is the idea of having the appropriate people respond. What kind of messaging do you use to make that happen? Because that's one of those big hills to climb for a lot of
people. Yeah. So again, you have to, as you look at the history of policing and again, understand that we've always had many issues in policing, the system of policing, to our entire justice system relative to race. So just so I mean, people know that and people understand that, get that. But one of the things that we have to realize is that if you want long-term sustainable crime reduction, violent crime reduction, you have to deal with the issues of why those crimes occur in the first place. And which means you have to devote resources, right? It's not going to be free. You're talking about a lot of people with mental health issues. You know, we don't hear enough conversations, especially in cities like Baltimore, about lead paint poisoning and what that does to the mental health of our young Black kids living in these broken down rental properties throughout Baltimore City. If you can devote the right resources to working with family units, now that family unit will look many different ways. You know, it may be a single parent, may have two parents. You may have an older sibling. It may have a grandparent, you know, as the head of the household. And you have to. We need things in place. Let me put a pin in that for a second. We had a program in Baltimore where throughout our school systems, and in policing, we were identifying what we call children in crisis. And we were working with the mental health community. Whenever law enforcement, first responders, emergency rooms, or teachers would come across a child who seemed to be having some real difficulties, whether it's anger, you know, whether it's something else, whether it's drug addiction or whatever, we grab that child and we start bringing resources to that child. The problem with that program is we brought the resources to the child, but we didn't bring the resources to the family unit, right? Many times we ended up pulling the child out of the family unit instead of saying, what else does this family, what else does this household need? There are no lights on in the house, all right? They need electricity, right? You know, wow, the mother never finished, or the father never finished high school. Maybe we can get them into a GED program. You know, we got employment issues here. Oh, the siblings are involved in you know, a crew or a gang or something like else, you know, look at the entire household in an effort to keep that household together. What do we need to do for them? Right? And that's going to take people, it's going to take the right people, it's going to take money, it's going to take resources. And when you look at any city, when you look at any town or county, what usually is the largest pile of money budget, it's police, it's public safety, it's corrections. And that's at the end of the train. That should be the caboose of the train, if at all, if it has a caboose at all. So we need to start pulling limited resources in the right way, in the right method, from corrections, from policing, and putting it at the front of the train to bring these resources to these troubled kids and their families and their households. That's not something that you can do in 2 years or 4 years, like a politician's election cycle. You know, they very seldom come up with long-term sustainable plans because they're only looking 2-4 years down the road and they're looking for quick data. But this is a generational plan that we're talking about here. You know, I mean, if we had unlimited money and resources and whatever, then maybe you could do it all at the same time. But what you need is a strategic long-term plan so you can start shifting funds. It's like how you run finances in your own home. I don't have millions or billions of dollars. I got a limited income coming in, right? What am I going to do with my money to make my house function as best as it possibly can? What are my priorities? And if my money is currently in things that don't bring value to my household, like if I'm spending money on, you know, things, cars and toys and this, that, and the other, and you know, the lights aren't on, or I got other issues, I got to start making moves to start transferring those funds, those limited dollars, to the right place, so that my household's going to function the way it needs to function, and it's going to be, you know, it's going to be sustainable. When it comes to violent crime, the police can only do things for a very short period of time. You know, we can go into hot spots and, you know, look at crime trends. You know, if we've got rapes occurring within this particular zip code, and the descriptions are coming back to what appears to be the same person, yeah, then we can saturate that area. We can do some things to find that person, because once you grab someone who's raping women, you know what, those rapes stop, right? Maybe we don't need to be focusing our resources on these undercover drug units. You know what? Because you can pull as many people off the streets for selling drugs as you want, but you know what? Them drugs are still gonna get sold, right? So how do we manage that? When I was in Baltimore as the head of human resources, and I had the budget, I was the head of human resources for 6 months there. Oh. And I had the budget. This was after I was the head of training. One of the things that I thought of, I was like, wow, we could save a ton of money if we disbanded what was then called the Organized Crime Division, where we had taken 300 men and women, 1/10 of the police department, and put them in these undercover cars to ride up and down the streets, pulling people off of the corners who they thought might be selling drugs. I mean, we could have saved millions upon millions of dollars, then redirected those funds into neighborhoods and communities to do these things that we're talking about, George.
Yeah, and those wraparound services offered it.
Yep.
Because for me, I understand. I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, right? And if you ever been to Trenton, it's very similar to Baltimore, you know.
Yep.
Love my city, but it you know, the hood has been our character, and we're proud of that, to, you know, in great degree. But it comes with its own set of problems and a lot of the issues we're talking about, right?
Right.
As a teenager, I moved to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, right? So we're going from Trenton, where we're talking about 75% African-American, wow, almost no white people on a day-to-day basis you really interact with, right?
Right.
To Oak Ridge, Tennessee, if you ever heard of it, it's the Manhattan Project City, secret city, but 75% white people, almost no black people.
That's a hell of a shift for you.
Oh, it's night and day. But the thing that becomes clear is all those excuses you would hear from people like Governor Christie when it's time to spend money on Trenton School. Oh, we ain't got no money. We broke. We ain't got no money, right? You go to Nashville, Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee, and you see when somebody's addicted to, has a pill issue, wraparound services are offered. There's no argument about it. They spend the money. Basically, this kid's important, so we're going to do what we need to do to help him.
Yep.
Just those kind of sentiments are never offered. But I realized that a big part of that comes from something I heard you say on the panel you were doing with Glenn Ford and Michelle Alexander. You were there at the panel leading up to her book, The New Jim Crow.
Yep.
And you were talking about how you're a policeman in recovery, right?
Yep.
So meaning you had to come to some point where you hit a wall, you realize this whole construction, something's off. And like a person in recovery, you had to literally kind of give the power away to somebody else, learn from them, and then start a path of making things better. So what was that wall you hit? What was the thing that made you stop and reassess?
There were a couple of things leading up to, let me just put it, the hardest part and the tallest part of this wall. Mm-hmm. One of the first things that really made my ears perk up was, and I've recently had a conversation, when I say recent in my world, it's within the past year, mm-hmm. With a young state trooper by the name of Sean Wallace. I was the regional commander for the Bureau of Drug and Criminal Enforcement in the state of Maryland for the state police. So I had the entire eastern shore of Maryland, everything east of the Bay, and I had 2 counties just north of Baltimore City also. I was a major then, and Sean Wallace was a brand new undercover Black state trooper working drugs, working on one of the task forces. And he had just gone through his evaluation. His sergeant gave him his evaluation. He wasn't happy with it. And he put in a request to speak to me about it. And I'm like, well, time out for a second. You know, between your sergeant and me, you've got a detective sergeant, you've got a lieutenant, you got a captain, you just can't come straight to me. But for some reason, I paused and I said, let me change things up here and see what he's talking about here. So I bypass all of those other folks and I bring them in the office. I said, Sean, I looked at your evaluation. It says, the only problem area I see, you got rated rather low where it comes to incentive. He says, yeah, he said, it's a problem. He says, and incentive is, we made most of our cases by using CI as confidential informants. And the way you get confidential informants in this drug war, you go out and arrest people for minor crap, minor bullshit. Can I say that on your show?
Oh, you're fine, yeah.
Smoking weed, doing stuff that we shouldn't be locked people up for, right? And then you flip them, you put the hammer to them and say, hey, you're going to do time unless you work for me. Mm. So he got rated low because he wasn't generating enough CIs. And how do you do that? You go out, you hang out at bars, you hang out at clubs, you hang out at places where people hang out using dope, log them up, and now you've got yourself some CI. Mm. And I said, Sean, well, I did it when I worked undercover. Why can't you do it? He says, man, you got to understand something. He says, I don't have time to do it because my sergeant keeps loaning me out to other task forces to work in Black neighborhoods and all across the Eastern Shore and even on the Western Shore. So every time I turn around, I'm given an assignment to go work on somebody else's team to go into some neighborhood and buy drugs, working undercover. And I like just paused for a minute and I was like, holy crap. First of all, on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, there ain't a whole lot of Black folks, right? There's Queen Anne's, there's Pocomoke City, and there's Salisbury, and there's Cambridge, right? And these little pockets, these little neighborhoods. And that's what we were doing. We were targeting these Black communities with people like Sean. And then I started thinking about, well, hell, that's what the hell I was doing. They sent me to do. And I was like, this is just not right. It wasn't too long after that. I left doing any more drug work, became the head of training for the state police. And then the very year after I retired from the state police, so this would have been like 2.5 years after I had this talk with Sean. Another Black state trooper who did a lot of undercover work. He was in undercover for about 13, 14 years. His name was Ed Totley. They had him assigned to work with the FBI down in Washington, D.C. buying cocaine from mid-level drug dealers. And long story short, he was killed one night in October of the year 2000, making a buy of cocaine. The guy assassinated him. He didn't know that Ed Totley was a cop. He just thought it was going to be a straight rip from somebody else selling drugs, right? And in order to do that in this game of this drug war, you know what? You kill, if you rip off a drug dealer, you know what? Someone selling drugs, you got to kill them.
Right.
They're going to come back at me. You know, they know where I am, who I am. So I got to do what I got to do, right? And that's what he did. Ed was a very good friend of mine. And that made me now stop and look at the violence that was involved in this game. And then shortly after Ed was killed in Baltimore, in East Baltimore, a family of 7, the Dawson family. There was a crew, they lived in a corner row house in East Baltimore, and there was a crew that set up at that intersection. And this mother, Angela, wanted to protect her boys, not from buying drugs and becoming addicted, but she didn't want them recruited into the crew to sell the stuff because now their lifespan drops dramatically.
Right.
Right. She did what we want people to do in policing, right? Hey, call us. We'll work with you. You know, we'll get these people selling drugs out of your neighborhood. You know, we'll make everything safe, blah, blah, blah. She was working with the police. The head of this crew found out about it and decided to send a message to the rest of the neighborhood by setting their home on fire in the middle of the night and killed the entire family. So it just made me wake up, you know, and take a critical look at Baltimore, a city I grew up in, which I knew very, very well, and the issues and problems. And I just asked the question, what would Baltimore be like if drugs were regulated and controlled, you know, for adults to use? And I said, well, right off the bat, our murder rate would drop, would literally go into the basement, right off the bat, right? Next, the quality control of the stuff that people would be using would be so much better. You know, you could put harm reduction programs in place because now you're not spending millions of dollars in policing and cops and courtrooms, and you can put millions of dollars into health programs and educational programs and job training, you know, and I mean, so much more that you could do with this big pot of money. And that was my wall, man. That was my wake-up call. And this was even before I knew the history of the war on drugs. This is before I knew that it was all motivated by race and culture, because they don't teach that in the police. Well, first of all, they don't teach it in schools, but then you go into policing and you would think that they would, nah, maybe not. But you don't learn it in policing. You don't learn the true history of the war on drugs. You don't learn the history of policing, the true history of policing, you know, while you're in there. And you come out believing the hype, the lie of what your job is within a community and how that's going to make your community better. So that, and there's a whole lot more to that, to my journey, which I'm still on. Now, as you know, I'm going all the way back to the year 2000. And here we are, 2021. It's been a couple decades for my journey. And of course, Michelle Alexander's book, who you mentioned, The New Jim Crow, in 2010, when she published her book, and I read that book, that opened my eyes even wider to the numbers of people, Black folks, that we haven't had incarcerated over those years. It had me thinking about my role in that, right? Everything from working undercover to the hundreds of people that I personally arrested, all the way up to where I was the regional commander that I was talking about, where now I'm running task forces, in charge of task forces that are arresting hundreds of people, thousands of people every year. And it made me reflect upon that. So I'm in recovery, brother.
But just that first step you took to realize this isn't right. It doesn't have to be a complicated idea. This isn't right. Well, what are we doing?
You know, right.
What are we doing? And once you find yourself in a room unable to actually answer that question, but you went far beyond what a lot of people would do. They may ask that question and then just kind of stop asking, more or less. You've taken that. So, I can't thank you enough for it.
And a lot of people say, well, but now you're retired talking. What about when you were still a cop? I was a cop still for 10 years after the year 2000. It was 4 years with the Baltimore Police Department. And during that time, I started speaking out about this. So I went live back in 2000 speaking about the failed racist war on drugs as I started and it took a while to educate myself on that, right? 4 years with the Baltimore Police Department. I then did 6 years with Maryland Transit. And I told both of those police chiefs that this is something I got to do. I have to publicly speak out about this stuff and talk about it. Obviously, I couldn't do it in uniform, right? But, and both of those police chiefs says, I get it. As long as you do it on your time and your dime, we're good with it. And so that's what I did. And then in 2010, I said, well, I can have a bigger platform and help recruit others to also talk about this, other police, and not just police, but prosecutors and some former judges and corrections folks. I can help recruit them. And that was back then when I became the executive director was Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. But now, since we've expanded our platform, talking about so much of the broken problematic justice system, and now the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And I did that for 10 and a half years.
And that's one of the things. So I was going to ask about the rebranding, what kind of brought that on. But as we discussed, just talking on the phone, in this country now, we're at 26 states that have legal marijuana.
Yeah.
When you first started off with LEAP, the notion that we were going to get there in any kind of a short time.
We had none, right?
I know the backlash you were facing during that time and all that kind of stuff. So again, I can't do anything but thank you.
Hey, no thanks needed, but it was a trip, man. It was literally a trip. In 2010, when I did become the director, you're right. There were some states out there with medical cannabis, but no one had adult markets, a regulated adult market. And the first real attempt was California. It was Proposition 19, which failed in 2010. And as a matter of fact, that was a huge educational opportunity for the country. Even though it failed, without that effort in California in 2010, we wouldn't have had the success in Washington State and Colorado 2 years later, right? But one of the most important people that a lot of people don't know this, for that Proposition 19 in California in 2010 was a lady by the name of Alice Huffman. Alice Huffman was the head of the state conference for the NAACP for California, Oregon, and Washington states.
Okay.
And this powerful sister, man, she was able to rally and educate the Black community in California about the racial implications of marijuana prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, again, it almost passed. But then when we got a couple years later working on Colorado and Washington State, that's when we were able to get it over the hump. And again, the NAACP, Alice Huffman played a huge role in that. And then also the president of Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming, she also played a huge role in that too. So, man, yeah, we finally, and Michelle Alexander's book had a lot to do with that as well, opening the eyes of people as to the racist war on drugs. So here we are now, man. But now we got another problem though, and that's racial equity with the regulated market, right? We've incarcerated many Black folks for using weed, for selling weed. And now that it's gone from, you know, the street corner to boardrooms, white males are cornering the legal regulated market. And every piece of policy for every state that comes online, I will not support a piece of policy to regulate to legalize marijuana in any state if it doesn't have a serious racial equity and social equity component. Racially, so that Black folks can not just work in the industry, not just own dispensaries, but to own growing facilities and processing facilities, right? Ownership, get licenses.
Mm-hmm.
On the social side, for those folks that have been incarcerated, right, now have a record, to have those records squashed so that they can participate in this regulated industry. Because we're talking about billions and billions of dollars going forward. And a lot of this, look, all communities consume and use cannabis at this relatively the same rates. So that means a lot of Black folks are going to be buying, they do buy and use marijuana, cannabis. So they need to have ownership.
So one of the questions that comes up from that, of course, is what's the model? Where is a place where we can say, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about Portugal's model and where they decriminalize almost all drugs, right? Not full legalization, they have decriminalization, comes with its own problems, but across the country in a uniform way, they said now a person's not going to be arrested, pulled out of their car for drugs, right?
Right.
So in the US now, it's great that we've had this progress, but there's some crazy cases where if you're in a state like West Virginia, right? Yeah. You just, you know, they're going to have their law actually come in this summer for recreational use, right? So on a Saturday night, you could be on this street, right? Having a party, smoking, everything's fine. If you go 2 streets that way, you're now illegal. You're going to get everything we've been talking about for the past 20 years, destruction of your life and livelihood. So pressing the current administration to just say, all right, critical mass, it's time. Federal decriminalization, federal legalization, right?
Right.
Not only is it time to do that, but as you were just talking about, the part where we actually get something put back in from what was taken away. How many of our fathers, brothers, entire families like the one you mentioned in Baltimore, been literally destroyed by this? If not killed, all their opportunities to make a way for themselves and their children taken away, right? So what does that look like when we decide to actually fix that? Where's a place you would cite, this is the one at the bleeding edge in the United States?
Yeah, so it seems like that when new pieces of policy, when new states come online, it does seem like, for the most part, the latest policy seems to be better than the one before it. Because what they're doing, they're looking at the states, you know, everybody first started looking at Colorado's policy and realized that, wow, we have some issues and problems here. Same thing with Washington State. Same thing with Oregon. You know, California was probably one of the first states that tried to do something that was really robust, not just with, you know, the tax dollars going back into those impoverished neighborhoods and communities that were devastated by the war on drugs, right? But also, again, how do we get more licenses into the hands, right, of Black folks and women, right? So now we've got, I think one of the best states to look at right now would be Illinois. Governor Pritzker has been behind the regulated adult market, you know, way before he even took office up there. And, you know, there were just key people put in key places regarding the policy and the regulation and how it would play out. Again, paying attention to those who had been incarcerated and convicted of these crimes, make sure that there were things and processes in place for expungement. You know, expunging those crimes, those marijuana related crimes, can't be the burden of the person who was incarcerated or charged and convicted. It needs to be automatic, right? It needs to be free. It needs to be automatic. It just needs to happen. So Illinois, I would look at Illinois. New Jersey is kind of interesting. I would definitely look at New Jersey, and believe it or not, Virginia,
right,
which isn't actually on, but Virginia's coming online. And I've done some work down in Virginia with the AG's office in Virginia. This was really interesting. A couple years ago, the Attorney General's office in the state of Virginia brought in folks from all across the country and had a summit. Now, this is sponsored by the AG's office. He brought in people from California. He brought in people from Illinois. He brought in people from different places to talk about their policies from a place of racial and social equity. That was the main part of the whole symposium. And now they're about to go live in Virginia. Got a governor that's behind it. Of course, the AG obviously is behind it. But a couple years ahead of time, started paying attention to the racial and social equity issues across the country regarding regulated markets. And so I'm really interested in seeing how that all plays out at the end of the day in the state of Virginia. I don't know what the hell's wrong with Maryland.
They need a push. They just need a push.
Man, I've been working that legislature in Maryland ever since 2010 for over a decade. And man, I don't know.
Sometimes they're just entrenched.
Yeah, deeply entrenched. But, you know, people, first of all, people gotta realize Maryland is still a Southern state. Technically, physically, it's a Southern state. But they're 2/3 Democratic. But the interesting thing is, even though they're 2/3 Democratic, when you look at the polling now of Democrats and Republicans regarding this issue, they're all up. They're all way up. The people just wanted to stop, regulate it all across the country. So you were talking about this federally. And so federally, you know, we have to get the MORE Act through, right? Kamala Harris was one of the initial architects as a senator for the MORE Act. You know, Cory Booker and also, you know, some others. But that has in it also a racial and social equity component. Is it the absolute best? Maybe not, but you improve it as you go along. But they're actually paying attention to it. So, you know, that was the main premise of it, not just to end marijuana prohibition federally, but to also pay strong attention to the racial and social equity components of it. So
Fixing that damage is part of it. That's because if you don't do that part, like we were talking about earlier, what you basically end up doing is saying, okay, young, rich, suburban white guy, right, who has money, here's another opportunity to make money, but the rest of the scenario just continues to play out. And that can't be where we allow this to go. And to a certain extent, that's what it's been so far.
That's right.
Like you said,
you know, it's interesting, man. Two quick things here. Number one, when I you know, I started thinking here, the House definitely supports the MORE Act. I think the Senate can get. I think we'll get it through the Senate eventually. I just don't have a lot of faith in Biden.
In personally signing
it. So I just wanted to say that just real quick. But this was like in 2012, I was on a radio show, and it was a radio show where people were calling in, you know, and we were talking about ending the prohibition of marijuana. And this young girl called in, and this is before I even really started paying attention to the equity issues, right, of a regulated market. And I was mainly focused on and talking about, you know, a beginning to ending the violence in our neighborhoods and communities by taking the money out of the illicit markets, you know, comparing it to alcohol prohibition and so on. This young sister calls in, and she says, yeah, I get all that. She says, I get it. And she says, I know we fighting each other and killing each other in our neighborhoods over this stuff, and you know, who's controlling what corner, this, that, and the other. But she said, I got a problem with this going into a regulated market, because what are we going to do for money? And I'm like, it was like crickets, man. I'm like, I got it. As soon as she said it, I got it. But I wasn't thinking about it before. It's like, holy crap, she's right. People are paying mortgages, rent, buying food, school supplies, keeping the lights on with that money, right? That underground money, right? Because jobs aren't all that plentiful.
Right.
You know, we got all these issues within our communities. People got, you know, criminal records. They can't get a job, but you know what? They can go out there on a corner and hustle a little bit, right? To take care of needs, you know, and to take care of the families. I'm like, damn. And so it was quiet. It was crickets for a while. She said, because then she said, all this money that we're currently making underground is now going to go into the hands of white folks. And she was absolutely right. And that was the moment I started thinking about the equity issues in a regulated market and what needs to happen regarding the laws and the policies going forward to ensure that this billion-dollar industry, it's not a new industry, it's just changing hands, right? It's just changing locations. We got to make sure that there's equity. We got to make sure that the money, where the money is currently benefiting families and communities on the illicit side, we got to have that on the regulated legal side as well.
Or even more.
And more, I was going to say even more so, right?
Mm-hmm. You know, here in Trenton, was in on the Zoom call, they had the Cannabis Regulatory Commission, right? And just now literally getting the zoning regs, all the things ready for where can a business be established, how far away from a school, all of the mundane details. They're going into all that good stuff. The conversations about micro businesses and providing funding, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is one, as you say, making sure that happens has to be done at that first step, because after the horse gets out of the box, right, and trying to catch it later on and say, hey, let's add some equity. No.
Yep.
Those lobbying dollars start to come in, those corporations start to come in, and what they want is what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I was actually in on that Zoom with Cannabis Regulatory here in Jersey. I said, why don't we go ahead and have it built in for interstate commerce? I get it. Federally, it's illegal, but the tri-state areas always functioned as a block.
Right. Right.
It's only a matter of time before PA joins in with us. New York already had it. And having the regs set up for that interstate commerce and set up for minority communities. What about that part of it? And you know, they did a good job talking about it, but it's definitely up to community leaders to come in and make those ideas clear. So just for Jersey, that's what I've been seeing from y'all.
That's a good point. And just like we did with when the first few states came online, they came online and said, okay, we're going to make the feds come after us. They're going to come after us. They're going to come after us. So we're doing something that's not federally legal, right? So I see it as the same process, right? So a group of states come together and say, hey, you know what? We're going to do our own little thing here regarding these state lines, and we're going to make the feds come after us, force the hand of the feds. And maybe that would help move this along, again, passing the MORE Act or whatever it's going to be, to end the federal prohibition of it all. But, and there's also another piece of federal policy we thought would pass even before the MORE Act, and that's the Safe Banking Act. That will allow these businesses to use federally regulated banks, so that employees aren't getting paid in cash. And again, you got all this cash flowing all over the place. It just, it sets people up for robberies and all kinds of other problems, when it comes to running an all cash business like that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I also, when you started talking about the interstate commerce part, made me think about alcohol prohibition again. And again, I continue to wonder, how could the federal government even prohibit the states from having a legal, cannabis industry or a legal cocaine industry or legal opium industry? How could they do that? Because they couldn't do it with alcohol, right? The feds couldn't pass alcohol prohibition without an amendment to the Constitution. So how is alcohol any different from these other drugs? So how, I'm really surprised that this hasn't been, or maybe it has been, maybe I'm just not aware of it, but appropriately contested to see if it even constitutional. And I know, so we always heard people talking about, this relative to the 10th Amendment, which is the Commerce Clause. How, and to end alcohol prohibition, they had to pass another amendment to end alcohol prohibition, because constitutionally that's how it had to be done. I don't know, man. I'm still a little confused about how the federal government could prohibit this within the state's boundaries. I'm not talking about crossing states lines. Like you said, Commerce Clause. How can these states are supposed to be sovereign, right? So you're supposed to be able to do these things within your borders, the borders of your state.
The laboratories of democracy, right?
Absolutely.
I think more than anything, it's just a testament to what Anslinger did, how effective he was. Because they probably had the power. If any of the states would have pressed it, they had the power to. But politically, just in people's minds, it had worked to a point where you have to argue with people now that reefer madness, this, and this, that's ridiculous. The jazz singers aren't going to come take your wife because they smoke weed.
Well, remember we were talking about in the late 1800s with opium and the Chinese, and again it was the white women who were going to these opium dens, so they saw themselves as protecting the white women. And now as you come forward, now you were talking about reefer madness, and if you've seen that film, again, it's all about taking advantage of white women, right? And these are the degenerates of our society who are doing that, and it's about marijuana. So it's about heroin and all this other stuff. But and yeah, you just continue to come forward for, through time. And geez. But here we are, you and I, we're having this discussion about drugs, policing, and these issues within our justice system, these problems. But at its core is race, culture, right? Is it possible for this country to really move forward in a positive way dealing with race and culture? I mean, even something, again, we're dealing with this COVID-19, and because of the clown who was in the White House calling it and referring to it as, and then, saying, oh, it's because of the Chinese, Kung flu and all this other stuff. One person with that platform, now you've got these attacks upon Asian Americans, just Asians in general. It doesn't, if you look Asian, you're now attacked, right? So how, when are we going to be able to do something positive about race, about culture in this country? Again, about immigration, religion, because, for the longest time, and we're still dealing with our Muslim brothers and sisters and what they have undergone since 9/11 in this country, right? So, the religion aspect of it, coupled with culture, coupled with race, and for the longest time, we've always known that the most problematic and violent group of folks in this country were right-wing extremists. These white supremacists, these groups and these organizations, these terrorist organizations, some of which were involved in the January 6th insurrection at Capitol Hill. The FBI has known for a very, very long time, way before 9/11, that these were our most problematic folks in this country. And now it's playing out.
It's a Waco and others in the 90s, we remember.
Back to Waco, Oklahoma City, with Timothy McVeigh, and bombing the federal building there in Oklahoma City. But
Ruby Ridge, just incidents across the nation's history.
Oh yeah, you can name one after another, after another, after another. And you can take that all the way back to the origins of the Klan, KKK, and just again coming forward. But we gotta figure this thing out about race, because so many of these policies, again, were born because of the racial conflict that we have in this country.
And that brings us full circle. We were talking about the origins of policing and how it's not really taught. How often do you think the word slave patrol, right, is ever mentioned in any police academy? Do you think it's talked about whatsoever? Or have you seen anybody who's kind of the leader who's bringing that in?
So I'm sure now that there are probably a couple of police academies across the country that are starting to do this. I can't point to one. I would bet that Camden, New Jersey, has that. Camden, New Jersey, and what they've done in literally disbanding and then restarting its police department, wrapped under another, even though it it was initially done because of funding issues. It created an opportunity for the community to really get involved in the reestablishing of the police department, and then continue to improve and improve and improve and improve and improve. I remember speaking to the chief back then. It was Chief Thompson back then, and yeah, his police officers on the other side of this, reinventing their police department, are taught a whole lot of stuff that the average police officer across the country is not. So that would be an example city to look at. Is it the best? No, it's a start, right? It's demonstrating that something different can be done. That's the beginning, and it's always going to be a work in progress. But that's definitely a good place to look when you're talking about defunding the police, when you're talking about reinventing the police, when you're talking about stopping what you have and starting over again, and when you start over again, making sure that the members of that police department know about the history of policing and the slave patrols, you know, in the South, and, you know, that they know about, you know, KKK, Klan operatives in policing, that they know about the paternalism, you know, the in policing, where, you know, from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, you know, fathers, grandfathers of these extremists, you know, in policing, you know, and their sons and their daughters coming in with the same mindset, right? You know, these police officers in Camden, you know, being able to understand the problems of the police unions generally, right? Police unions across this country, generally speaking, continue to be the reservoirs of racism in policing. That's why in the 1970s, we had the birth of organizations like the National Black Police Association, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE, you know, then eventually come Latino police officer organizations, even women policing organizations, because the established police union, the FOP, which is the largest police union, they weren't, I'm gonna say, and not because they couldn't, they wouldn't deal with the issues of Black and brown and women police officers. So they had to form their own, we had to form our own groups, right? To then go to the politicians and go to the press and go elsewhere and have lawsuits, you know, to deal with the internal racism in police, promotions, job assignments, discipline. And we're still dealing with that today. We're still suing police departments today because of these disparity issues, the internal racism. Now, if you can't solve the internal racism in policing,
right,
how can you expect to solve it within the communities they police? It's not going to happen.
That's a question I've actually asked a couple of police officers before, because you get the thing, you know, we see everything that's happening. Everybody has their camera phone out. Oh, you're so hostile to us. We feel so scared, right? But you know, nothing's like the 60s and 70s anymore. We're not doing that to Black people. Look, I'm a Black cop. I've been told these things. And then when I asked, so, okay, if there's no issue, why do you have a specific union that's just for the Black cops?
Yeah.
And it's, you know, everything you just said is obvious. That's the reason why. But yeah, the tiptoeing and I was told at one point we wanted to have our own photo ops with a straight face. But, you know, these and other issues we're going to continue to work on. One thing I wanted to close with you with is something that I see on LEAP's website. They do a good job of talking about policing and how all of this started off in the beginning. So we go into Sir Robert Peel's policing principles, right?
Yeah.
Robert Peel, you guys reference as the father of modern policing, right? And in 1829, he gave us this. This is his last principle of policing. He said, to recognize always that the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder, and not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with it. Profound thing this man said hundreds of years ago at this point.
Absolutely. And that's when you look at those 9 principles, and for your viewers, just go to our website, lawenforcementaction.org. Down at the bottom, you'll see what George is referring to regarding these principles. Like you said, back in the 1800s, and these are still relevant today. And what really boggles my mind is that every police chief that I talk to, I almost every, if I remember, I asked them and I said, so what do you think about the 9 basic policing principles, the Peelian principles? And do you go by them in your police department? Oh yeah, we think they're great. We go by them, they're relevant. And it's bullcrap, because very, very, very few do in this country. You go over in Europe, and a lot of police departments, really, that is their foundation. That's why they kill so many fewer people than police here in the United States, and they handle it. That's why their training is so intense and long in duration, and they just view things differently. They view police service differently. Principle number 2 is my favorite, because principle number 2 pretty much says that we, the police, not only should be doing what you, the public, want us to do in your neighborhoods and communities, but we even exist because you want us to exist, right? So to me, that's related to this whole funding and defunding thing, because basically I believe that the community has to have some control, if not most of the control, over its police department. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a board of community members that hire and fire the police chief, the executive, control the budget, establish the philosophy for policing in their city or town, not a mayor, not a city manager, not one person, not a governor, but a collection of the public. That's what principle number 2 says to me, right? So I think it's important going forward, as we reinvent police. Number 1, we have to have a core set of principles, hopefully one from coast to coast, a core set of policing principles that everyone knows and everyone is familiar with, so that we know what to expect from police, and police know what their job is, and what the core values are, right? So we need a core set of principles. That's number 1, so we can get everybody on the same page. And then second, we need community control of our police department, so that we get it away from politics and truly put that into the hands of the people, so that the people have say over the budget, the policing philosophy, and who's going to manage that for them as the police chief or commissioner, whatever that person is.
And the whole notion of defund is something that would come up in that scenario when everything has gone wrong, right? When we've come to the point, there's no confidence in you as an institution. The notion of you policing our cities is tantamount to an invading army just occupying our city.
Yep.
You go over cities in the United States, I would include Trenton, I would include Baltimore, and many more, right? A lot of the residents will tell you, this is an occupying force here. Keeping me safe has nothing to do with what these people are talking about.
You're right.
Of Leap and Major Neil Franklin and others who have been pushing for this for decades now is to change that in the United States. And you got my support,
Thank you. Thank you, brother.
Yes, sir. So for topics like this and many more, I want to invite you on. I'm sure things are going to happen throughout the year where we're going to need to touch back on some of these things and other things related. So open invitation anytime you want, please. Okay.
Oh, absolutely. Unfortunately, yeah, we're going to have a lot of work a lot of issues popping up. But it's shows like yours, having these conversations and bringing people on, talk about these issues to help educate folks. This is what's important, because we have all the conversations that over a cup of coffee at a table or whatever, but you reach thousands of people. And, so keep up the great work with what you're doing, with your show and getting this information out. God bless you, brother.
And we'll keep it going.
We'll keep it going.
Yes, sir. On Facebook, Patreon, YouTube, everybody tuned in with Ward Media and Entertainment. We again thanking Major Neil Franklin here with the it was a Maryland State Police, correct?
Maryland State Police. Yeah, they're the ones I officially retired from. Yep.
But the group that I know him from, Leap, our executive director, and now a retired man, giving us lots of information, lots of things for people to respond to. So please comment, share, subscribe, and thanks for tuning in. Anything?
Yeah, still in the fight.
Any events or anything for people to look at coming up?
Nothing right off the top of my head. Unfortunately, COVID-19. We used to be in tons of events from coast to coast dealing with these issues. But what I'll do is I'll get with our staff and see if they've got some things come up, maybe some town halls that they're aware of and some different things that people can check out. And I'll send it to you.
I love it. All right. Again, for Ward Media and Entertainment, this is George reporting in. Again, thanks to Major Neil Franklin.
You bet.